The encounter, Jada Sinclair, had always prided herself on her ability to stay composed in any situation. It was a quality that had been instilled in her from the moment she walked into her first day at the FBI as a special agent. To maintain calm under pressure was not only vital to her job, but also to her survival. She had faced danger, threats, and uncertainty many times before, but today, she would face something entirely different. The sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. Jada was tired, having just finished a long day of paperwork and a series of case briefings. Her mind was on her quiet evening ahead, perhaps a hot bath, a good book, and some much-needed rest. The peacefulness of the moment was abruptly interrupted when the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser lit up in her rearview mirror. Jada wasn't concerned. She was a professional used to encounters with local law enforcement, especially since her work often required cooperation between agencies. It was a routine, part of the job. She smoothly pulled her black sedan to the side of the road, the tires humming gently against the pavement as the car slowed. She rolled down her window and waited, her hands resting calmly on the steering wheel. She made a mental note of the officer's vehicle as it stopped behind her, noting the number of the police cruiser and the markings on the side. A tall man in a dark uniform stepped out, his silhouette blocking out the setting sun. He was imposing, with a jaw set like stone and eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. Jada instinctively sized him up, noting his posture, the slight tension in his movements. He approached her car slowly, his boots clicking against the asphalt. "License and registration?" the officer said as he drew closer. His voice was gruff, devoid of any warmth. The kind of voice one would expect from someone who had seen too many bad days. Jada nodded, keeping her hands visible as she reached for her purse, and retrieved her ID and documents. She handed them to him, still calm, her movements measured. The officer's eyes darted over the documents, then shifted back to her face. There was something in the way he looked at her, a quick, almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes. Scanned her with an intensity that felt more like a judgment than a routine check. "FBI, huh?" the officer muttered. His voice had lost some of its professionalism, replaced by a thin layer of skepticism. "Let's see your badge." Jada's heart didn't skip a beat. She had been through enough situations like this before, though never with an officer quite like him. She unhooked her badge from her belt, holding it up for him to see. It was a simple gesture, one she had done countless times. But this time, the officer's reaction was different. The officer's eyes widened, but only for a moment. His lips curled into a smirk as he glanced at her badge, then back to her face. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You, FBI?" he scoffed. "What kind of joke is this?" Jada was taken aback. She had dealt with disrespect before, but never from someone in law enforcement. Her mind raced for a moment as she carefully examined the situation. It didn't make sense. This wasn't the typical type of response she was accustomed to. He wasn't just questioning her credentials. He was mocking her. She inhaled slowly, drawing on the training that had been drilled into her over the years. "Keep calm. Always remain professional." "I'm Special Agent Jada Sinclair," she said, her voice unwavering. "I've identified myself already. You're free to check with your department if you need confirmation." The officer didn't seem impressed by her calmness. If anything, it only seemed to provoke him further. He took a step closer to the car, his body language now tense. "You really think that little piece of metal makes you special?" he spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "What are you, some kind of hero? Age?" Jada's eyes narrowed slightly, but her posture remained relaxed. "I'm doing my job, officer," she said, carefully keeping her tone neutral. "And I suggest you do yours." "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's hand twitched slightly at his side. Jada's mind registered the movement almost immediately. His fingers were near his holster. "Step out of the car," the officer ordered, his voice more forceful now. His hand hovered near his gun, and for a brief moment, Jada felt a surge of unease. This wasn't normal. Something about this situation didn't feel right. "Why would I get out of the car, officer?" she asked calmly, her heart rate steady. even though the tension in the air was palpable. "I've given you my identification. I'm cooperating fully. You don't get to question me?" the officer snarled. "I'm in charge here." Jado's eyes narrowed as she observed his clenched jaw and his hand still hovering too close to his weapon. The officer's posture was now aggressive, far more than it should have been for a routine traffic stop. She carefully evaluated her options. She could feel the shift in the air, the silent escalation of power in his mind. The situation was quickly spiraling into something far worse than it needed to be. Jada knew how to handle tense moments, but she also knew when she was being pushed too far. "Listen," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I don't want any trouble, but I'm not going to let you make a mistake here." The officer sneered at her, stepping closer to her window, his gun now fully visible in his hand. "Your badge means something to me. I'm the one with the power here." Jada's instincts screamed that she needed to de-escalate, but she also knew that this officer was out of line. She couldn't back down. Not when his hand was that close to his weapon. Her fingers hovered over the steering wheel, contemplating. Her next move? She could call for backup, but the officer was already so far gone in his aggression that it might be too late. She had to act now. Escalating tension. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Jada could feel the officer's presence looming over her, his shadow stretching across the driver's seat as he stood right outside her window, the gun in his hand now. Unmistakable. The way he held it, his fingers poised just above the trigger, was enough to send a chill down anyone's spine. Jada's mind worked at lightning speed, analyzing the situation, mentally running through all the steps she had been trained to take, but this was different. This officer wasn't following protocol, and the dangerous thing was, he didn't seem to care. "Step out of the vehicle." Now the officer growled, his voice low and menacing. Jada's pulse quickened. This wasn't a traffic stop. It was an escalation, one she hadn't seen coming. Despite the discomfort creeping up her spine, she didn't let it show. Her body remained still, her grip tight on the wheel, her hands now clammy but steady. She knew that if she moved the wrong way, the situation could spiral into something far worse. "Why should I get out of the car?" Jada asked, her voice firm but calm. "I've already identified myself. You're not in any position to give me orders like this." The officer sneered at her, his lips curling with contempt. "You think I'm scared of your badge? I don't care who you are. Get out of the car. Now." Jada's mind raced. She had no intention of complying with his demand. Everything about the officer's actions screamed danger. His body language was hostile, his demeanor outright antagonistic. He was trying to assert dominance, and he was doing it in the worst possible way, by threatening her. Her training kicked in, and she took a deep breath, focusing on what needed to be done. Every second counted. Every movement mattered. Jada knew she had to tread carefully. Any wrong step could turn this from a tense confrontation into something far more violent. But she also knew that she wasn't just any woman on the side of the road. She was an FBI agent. She wouldn't be intimidated. "I'm not getting out of the car," she said slowly, her eyes never leaving the officer's face. "I have no reason to." The officer's face twisted with anger, and his grip on the gun tightened. "You're under arrest for disobeying an officer's orders." Jada's heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She knew the law, and she knew her rights. But this man wasn't interested in reason. His actions weren't about upholding justice. They were about power, his need to assert control over her. He hadn't even given her a chance to explain herself, to give any valid reason for his suspicion. The officer stepped even closer, his gun now aimed directly at her through the open window. His finger was resting lightly on the trigger, and Jada felt a surge of dread at the thought of what might happen if he pulled it. Her eyes flicked to her phone on the passenger seat. She had been waiting for the right moment to act. This was it. Slowly, Jada shifted in her seat, keeping her movements deliberate. "I'm calling this in," she said, her voice laced with authority. "I'm documenting this for the record." Before the officer could react, Jada reached across the seat, grabbed her phone, and unlocked it. Her thumb hovered over the emergency contact button, an option specifically designed for situations like this. One tap would alert her colleagues and local law enforcement that she was in danger. Jada had done this more times than she could count in her career, but never in a situation quite like this. The officer's gaze flickered to the phone in her hand, and for a brief moment, his grip on the gun loosened. Jada saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the realization that perhaps this wasn't a situation he could control. But that moment of hesitation didn't last long. He took a step forward, his body stiff with aggression. "I don't care if you're calling the president," the officer spat. "You're going to step out of this car, or I'll make you." Jada's mind was working quickly. She couldn't let him back her into a corner. She couldn't allow this to escalate any further. The gun was still aimed at her, and she knew that one wrong move would trigger an explosion of violence. Her fingers tapped the screen, sending the emergency alert to Malik Turner, her fellow FBI agent who was stationed nearby. The alert wasn't just a request for help, it was a signal. It would send a GPS location, and the moment Malik received the alert, he'd know where she was, and he'd know that the situation had gone from routine to dangerous. "You really want to go down this path?" Jada said, her tone now colder, more assertive. "'Cause you're not dealing with just anyone. I'm Special Agent Sinclair of the FBI, and you're threatening a federal agent?" The officer's eyes flickered for a second, and Jada saw a slight tremor in his hand. For just a moment, it looked like the officer might back off, but then the fear in his eyes shifted to rage. He wasn't just scared anymore, he was embarrassed. For someone like him, embarrassment was something he couldn't tolerate. "Out of the car, or I'll drag you out myself," he snarled,
Ice.
his voice rising with every word. Jada's grip tightened on her phone, but she remained calm. She'd been in situations like this before, highly charged moments where any misstep could lead to catastrophe. But she had learned long ago that the key was always to stay one step ahead, to control the narrative, to remain calm. "I've already told you I'm not getting out," she said, her voice unwavering. "If you don't lower your weapon and step back, I'll be forced to defend myself." The officer didn't flinch. Instead, he took another step closer to the car, his eyes wild with fury. "I don't care who you are," he growled, his face inches from hers. "I'm giving you one last chance. Step out now." Jada's breath hitched in her chest, but she didn't show fear. She didn't flinch. She was a professional, and she would not let this man dictate her actions. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her second piece of defense, a hidden device that would record audio and video. She hit the button and slipped it into the cup holder between them, ensuring the officer wouldn't notice. The audio and video feed would be recorded, and that would be her backup when things went south. She had the evidence, and she wasn't about to back down now. Before the officer could say another word, she heard the unmistakable sound of sirens in the distance. The rush of adrenaline was sudden, but she felt a surge of hope. What was on the way? The officer's eyes darted to the road, panic setting in as the sirens grew louder. He hesitated, unsure whether to make a move or retreat. But Jada didn't let him dictate the next step. She had already won the first round, and she wouldn't let him take control? The call, Jada could feel the officer's tension in the air, almost as if his hostility was a physical force pressing in on her. The sirens were growing louder, coming closer, and for a split second, Jada allowed herself to breathe a little easier, but she didn't let her guard down. This was far from over. The officer's eyes were now darting back and forth from Jada to the approaching sirens. His grip on the gun loosened ever so slightly, but the anger in his face didn't dissipate. If anything, it intensified. His jaw clenched tighter, and his eyes seemed to narrow, his focus now solely on her. "You think you can call for backup and get away with this?" he spat, stepping back slightly but still keeping his gun aimed at her. "You've already broken the law by refusing to cooperate. Now you're going to face the consequences." Jada's heart rate quickened, but she remained composed. She could feel the impending storm building, but she was no longer concerned. She had a plan. She had already called it in. The backup was on its way. The evidence she had was being recorded. The faint hum of police radios could now be heard in the distance, and Jada knew that they wouldn't be alone for much longer. She just needed to stall, to keep him talking, to ensure that when her colleagues arrived, There was no question about what had transpired. "I'm not going to be intimidated," Jada said, her voice low and firm. "I'm an FBI agent. I have the right to be here, and you don't get to violate that." The officer's eyes flared with anger. "Don't lecture me, lady," he snarled. "I'm the one in charge here. You're just a civilian in my jurisdiction." "Just a civilian?" Jada repeated, her eyebrows rising in disbelief. "Did you even hear what you just said?" For a moment, the officer seemed to hesitate, as if her words had struck him harder than he expected. He took another step back, glancing down the road where the sirens were now unmistakably close. Jada could see the unease beginning to settle into his posture. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but it was something close. "Is that how you treat everyone who questions your authority?" Jada continued, her tone now sharper. "You pull a gun on them just because they don't fall in line." The officer's face reddened with humiliation. His finger twitched near the trigger, but his hand remained still. It was on the edge, now caught. Between pride and the realization that he was completely in the wrong, but before he could respond, Jada's phone buzzed. The screen flashed with a new notification. Malik. Her pulse quickened again, but this time it was a feeling of relief. Malik had received the alert. He and the rest of the backup were close. But she couldn't afford to look away from the officer. Not yet. With calculated precision, she kept her eyes on him, ignoring the buzzing phone for now. "You're about to make a huge mistake," Jada said, her voice steady. "This is your chance to back down. You don't want to escalate this further." For a brief moment, the officer hesitated, the weight of her words finally sinking in. He glanced over his shoulder, as if considering his options. But then he must have convinced himself that he had control again. His shoulders squared, and the rage returned to his expression. "You think you can intimidate me with your badge?" he sneered, taking a step forward once more. "You're just a woman in a car. I don't care who you are." Jada's breath caught in her chest. She had seen this before. Men who used their power to dominate others. Men who couldn't stand the idea of someone challenging their authority. It wasn't about her being an FBI agent. It was about her being a woman and, in his eyes, a black woman. To him, that was the most threatening thing of all. But Jada had never been one to shy away from a challenge. She didn't back down when she was right, and she wasn't going to start now. She took a deep breath, her hand hovering over her phone as the buzzing continued. This was it. It's the moment she had been waiting for. "I'm calling my supervisor," Jada said coolly, reaching over to pick up her phone. She could feel the officer's eyes on her, burning into her, but she didn't flinch. "And when they hear what you've done, they're going to have a lot more questions for you than I." Before the officer could respond, Jada answered the call, her finger swiping across the screen. "Malik, it's Jada. I need backup now." Her voice was low, controlled, but the urgency was there. Malik's voice came through the phone almost immediately. "Jada, what's going on?" Malik's voice was calm, but there was an edge of concern. "I've got a hostile officer here," Jada explained, her eyes still trained on the man in front of her. "He pulled a gun on me after I identified myself. He's refusing to back down, and I need you to get here now." The officer's eyes widened when he heard Jada's side of the conversation. He was starting to realize that he had crossed a line, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat. His grip on his gun tightened again. "I'm not going to ask you again," the officer hissed. "Step out of the vehicle." But Jada didn't flinch. She knew Malik and the others would be here in moments. She wasn't about to let him drag her out of the car, not when she had already told him she wouldn't comply. "I'm not stepping out of the car," Jada replied firmly, her gaze never wavering. "You've already threatened me once. You're not getting another chance?" The officer's breath quickened, and for the first time, Jada saw genuine fear in his eyes. He was realizing that he had made a grave mistake, and that the consequences were coming for him, whether he wanted them to or not. "I'm not going to let you make me the villain here," Jada continued. "You were the one who escalated this? You were the one who pulled a weapon on an FBI agent." The officer's finger hovered nervously over the trigger of his gun, but he didn't pull it. Not yet. He was stuck. Caught between his own pride and the sinking realization that he was about to be exposed for what he really was. Man who abused his power. Malik's voice came through the phone again, more urgent this time. "We're 2 minutes. Out, Jada. Stay put. Don't do anything rash." Jada's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror as she saw the flashing lights in the distance. Backup was almost there. She just had to hold her ground a little longer. But the officer wasn't finished. He stepped closer, his gun still aimed at her. His entire body was tense with anticipation, his knuckles white from gripping his weapon too tightly. This wasn't about the law anymore. It was about him trying to reassert control. "I don't want any more problems," Jada said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "But you're running out of options. Put the gun down." For a moment the officer just stood, there staring at her. The sirens were deafening now, but they only seemed to add to the weight of the moment. And then, with a sudden jerk of his arm, the officer did something unexpected. He lowered the gun, though he didn't holster it. It was enough. It was the first sign that Jada had won this battle. The reveal. The officer's hand shook as he lowered the gun, his fingers still twitching with nervous energy. For the first time since the encounter began, Jada felt like she had the upper hand. She remained calm, watching the officer closely, every muscle in her body coiled with anticipation. The sirens were loud now, and in the distance, she could see the flashing lights reflecting off the rearview mirror. Backup was almost here. But even as the officer made the first move toward compliance, she knew that the situation was far from over. Jada's mind raced. Every second counted. She knew that the officer might still try something unexpected, a last-ditch effort to reassert his authority or escape the consequences of his actions. His lowering of the gun wasn't a sign of surrender, just a temporary shift in the balance of power. And that made him even more dangerous. "Good," Jada said softly, her voice steady, but carrying a quiet authority. "Now, I want you to put your weapon away and step back from the car." The officer's eyes flicked to the weapon still held loosely in his hand, then back to her. For a moment he looked like he might snap, like he might try to make a break, for it or escalate again, but the reality was setting, in the reality that his actions had been caught. That there were now witnesses who could verify every word Jada had said. The backup officers would be here any second. And Jada wasn't going to give him the chance to cause more trouble. "I'm telling you, you don't want to do this," Jada said, her voice unyielding. "I'm a federal agent. You point a gun at me, and you've broken the law. You don't get to walk away from that." The officer didn't respond immediately, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. But his grip on the gun loosened further, and he finally took a step back, lowering the weapon to his side. Jada felt a brief surge of victory. He was giving in. She wasn't about to let her guard down just yet. There was still the matter of the approaching backup. It wouldn't be long before the officer's fate was sealed. But there was no telling what he might do in those final moments, as she observed him. Jada couldn't help but feel a twinge of disbelief. She had encountered plenty of hostile law enforcement officers before, but none had ever been so brazen, so reckless. This officer wasn't just an outlier. He represented the ugly truth of an ingrained system of power that seemed to think it was above the law. The disrespect he showed her as a black woman in a position of authority was no accident. It was part of the silent but pervasive culture of systemic inequality, and that was something Jada would never allow to go unchecked. Her phone buzzed in her hand once more, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Malik again, the urgency in his voice unmistakable, even through the device. "Jada, we're here. Where's the officer?" Jada glanced over her shoulder, seeing the flashing lights of 2 police cruisers coming into view. The officer hadn't made a move to escape yet, was still standing there, gun lowered, but the tension in the air was palpable. He had lost the upper hand, but not his arrogance. "I've got him under control." "Malik, get out here," she said into the phone. "We've got a lot to go over. I'm on my way, Jada. Stay safe." Jada didn't respond, but she felt a sense of relief wash over her as she saw the backup cars coming to a stop behind the officer's cruiser. The officers quickly exited their vehicles, their expressions grim as they took in the situation. Jada stayed where she was, watching the officers approach. But just as they started to make their way over, the officer spoke. his voice low, but filled with barely contained frustration. "You really think you can get me in trouble?" He spat, his eyes flashing with anger. "You think your precious FBI is going to protect you when I'm done with you?" Jada's lips curled into a tight smile. "Swear you're wrong," she said calmly. "This isn't about me. It's about the law. Right now you've broken it." The backup officer stopped short, clearly taking in the scene. The officer's gun was now at his side, but his stance was still aggressive. His face was flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment, as if he couldn't quite comprehend the magnitude of his mistake. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, but Jada held her ground, unwavering. One of the backup officers, a tall man with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward. His eyes flicked from the officer to Jada, and then to the gun in the officer's hand. His voice was calm but stern as he addressed the officer. "Put the weapon down, Officer Harris," the backup officer said. "You're under arrest." Jada could see the shift in the officer's eyes. It was as if the world had just collapsed around him. The cocky smirk was gone, replaced by an expression of disbelief. "You can't arrest me," he muttered, as if trying to convince himself, "I'm a cop, I'm in charge here." "No," the backup officer responded firmly. "You're not in charge here anymore. Step back." It was only then that the full weight of the situation seemed to hit Officer Harris. His shoulders sagged, and for a split second, Jada saw a flicker of defeat in his eyes. He had no choice now. His fate had been sealed. Jada took a step back as the officers moved in to cuff him, her eyes never leaving him. This wasn't just about the arrest. It was about sending a message. It was about showing him and every officer like him that no one, no matter how much power they thought they had, was above the law. As the officers led Harris toward one of the cruisers, Jada couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. She had kept her composure, had kept the situation from turning into something even worse. The worst part of it was over. But she also knew that this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of a much larger story. The backup officers turned to Jada, their faces filled with respect, but also the understanding of what she had just endured. "You did good, Sinclair," one of them said quietly. "I don't know how you stayed so calm." Jada shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "It's just part of the job." But she knew better than anyone that this was more than just a job. This was a fight for justice, one she was going to continue to wage, no matter the personal cost. And as Officer Harris was driven away in the back of a patrol car, she couldn't help but feel that this small victory was just the beginning, as the flashing lights grew fainter in the distance. Jada turned and walked back to her car, her thoughts heavy with the knowledge that the road ahead would be long. Was concerned, she was ready for whatever came next. The moment of truth, the last remnants of the sunset had faded, and the cool night air began to settle in as Jada stood beside her car, watching as Officer Harris was led away in cuffs. Her mind was still processing what had just transpired, what could have escalated into a tragic encounter had she not kept her cool. It had been a close call, but it was over for now. The immediate danger had passed. Jada knew, though, that the real work had just begun. The backup officers, Malik, and the others had gathered around, their expressions sober as they took in the situation. This wasn't just about a single incident. It was about the deeper issues of systemic abuse of power, racial profiling, and the culture that allowed officers like Harris to act with impunity. They all knew it, even if they didn't speak it. Aloud, Malik finally reached her side, his expression hard to read, but the concern in his eyes was undeniable. He had seen her go through dangerous situations before, but this one had shaken him more than he expected. He stepped closer, his voice low as he spoke to her. "You okay, Jada?" Malik asked, his eyes scanning her face for any signs of distress. "I've never seen you so ... calm under pressure. That was a hell of a situation." Jada nodded slowly, her mind still racing as she processed the events. "I'm fine, Malik," she said quietly, but the words didn't seem to carry the same certainty they once had. She wasn't fine. She hadn't been fine in a long time. But there was no time for reflection now. "It's not about me, though. It's about what happened here. What happens every day in this country." Malik's eyes narrowed, and his jaw tightened. He understood. Yeah, I get it. But still, you handled yourself like a pro. I don't. Know how you stayed so calm? Thought he was going to pull that trigger any second. Jada let out a slow breath, her gaze turning toward the flashing lights in the distance as Harris was loaded into the back of a patrol car. It's not about staying calm, Malik, she said, her voice steady but filled with an underlying frustration. It's about doing what I have to do. He was already making mistakes, and I just... had to make sure it didn't go any further. Malik looked at her, his face reflecting both admiration and concern. He knew what she meant, knew that Jada had been in enough life-threatening situations to understand the delicate balance of power. He also knew that this wasn't just about one rogue officer. This was about a system that allowed officers like Harris to get away with this kind of behavior time and time again. Do you think it's going to change anything? Malik asked after a moment, his voice quieter now. I mean, this whole thing with Harris, are they going to do something about it? Jada didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked back at the cruiser where Harris was now being taken into custody, her thoughts clouded with doubt. She had done everything, right, everything by the book. She had stayed calm, she had documented the situation, and she had alerted the right people. But would it matter? I don't know, she said quietly, her voice edged with resignation. Maybe it'll make a difference. Maybe it won't. But I can't keep hoping for change, Malik. I have to make it happen. The words hung in the air between them, a sobering reminder of how much work there still was to do. But before Malik could respond, a voice cut through the silence, pulling them both out of their thoughts. Agent Sinclair? Jada turned to see one of the backup officers walking toward her, his face etched with concern. He had been standing off to the side while the other officers had dealt with the paperwork and secured Harris, but now he approached her with a serious expression. Yes, Jada replied, her attention now fully on him. There's something you should know, the officer said, his voice low and cautious. We've been running Officer Harris's background, and, well, it's not pretty. Jada's brow furrowed. What do you mean? The officer hesitated for a moment, glancing over his shoulder as if to ensure no one was listening too closely. We've been looking into his record. It turns out he's been involved in some questionable incidents before. Multiple complaints from civilians and even fellow officers. Wasn't enough to get him suspended, but there's a pattern. Jada's heart skipped a beat. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed felt like a punch to the gut. Harris wasn't just some rogue officer acting out of character. He was part of a larger problem, a product of a system that had allowed his behavior to go unchecked. For far too long? I knew it, she muttered under her breath, her fists clenching at her sides. He's been getting away with this, and no one stopped him. The officer nodded. That's the problem. We have a system that protects bad apples, and he's just one of many. But this, he paused, glancing back at Harris one last time. This might be the catalyst we need to make sure he's held accountable. Jada's mind was spinning. This wasn't just about a bad cop being arrested. This was about something deeper, something systemic that allowed men like Harris to continue their reign of terror, unchecked and unpunished. She knew that the arrest would make headlines, but would it be enough to bring about real change? Would the department actually do something about it? I'm going to make sure this doesn't go unnoticed, Jada said, her voice cold and determined. This is just the beginning. Malik glanced at her, his eyes filled with understanding. What are you thinking, Jada? I'm thinking. It's time to push back, she replied firmly. Harris isn't the only one. We need to expose this kind of behavior, make sure people see it for what it is. And if I have to go public with this, I will. The backup officer who had spoken to her nodded in agreement. We've got your back, Agent Sinclair, he said. This isn't just your fight anymore, it's all of ours. Jada felt a flicker of hope, a brief but powerful moment where she could see the potential for change. Maybe, just maybe this, was how it would start. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles. And even though she had the backing of some officers who wanted to do what was right, she also knew that many others would try to bury the truth. It wasn't just about taking down one officer, it was about taking down a system. As she walked back to her car, the weight of the moment pressed heavily on her chest. She had no illusions about what lay ahead. But she wasn't afraid. She had faced down far worse. She knew that this fight for justice was one worth having. "We'll make it count, Malik," she said quietly, her voice resolute, "one step at a time." Malik gave her a slight nod, and for a moment, they stood there together, both understanding the gravity of what they had just witnessed, what was to come. But as the night settled in around them, Jada felt a small flicker of resolve light up within her. This wasn't just a fight for justice. This was a fight for the truth, and she would see it through to the end. The reckoning. Jada sat at her desk late into the night, the glow of her computer screen illuminating her face as she reviewed the details of the incident involving Officer Harris. She had gone through the arrest report several times, reading over her own statements, the backup officers' accounts, and Harris's background. The more she read, the more she realized that this wasn't just an isolated case, it was a small piece of a much larger, more insidious puzzle. As she scrolled through the list of previous complaints against Harris, the names of the people who had come forward over the years began to stand out. A woman claiming excessive force during a traffic stop. A man alleging racial profiling. Fellow officers accusing Harris of misconduct, but none of them ever willing to take it further. The common thread: Harris had always managed to escape discipline. Sliding under the radar of the system that was supposed to protect the public, Jada leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes as exhaustion set in. She had been working non-stop since the encounter on the side of the road, trying to piece together the truth. But now, with the evidence piling up in front of her, she felt a weight settle in her chest. The system had failed these people for far too long, and it had failed her too. She had seen the abuse of power firsthand, but even now, she had to wonder how much of it was really being addressed behind closed doors. Malik had told her earlier that they were making strides, but she wasn't so sure. The arrest of Officer Harris was just the first step, but in a department so entrenched in its ways, one arrest might not be enough to spark the change that was needed. She had to be careful. She couldn't risk everything on a single victory. Just as Jada was about to close her laptop, there was a knock at her door. Her head snapped up, her hand instinctively reaching for the gun at her hip. But it wasn't necessary. Malik stood in the doorway, his expression tight with the kind of resolve that she had come to recognize over the years. "You still here?" Malik asked, his voice a little softer now. Jada nodded, gesturing for him to come inside. "Just going over the report. He's trying to figure out what happens next." Malik stepped into the room and sat across from her, his face serious. He'd always been her confidant, the one she could count on in the toughest of situations. But even he couldn't disguise the unease in his eyes. "We've got a problem," Malik said, his voice low. "Words already spreading about Harris, not just around here. It's going outside the department. The media is picking it up." Jada's heart sank. She had known this would happen. The moment the arrest became public, it would stir up the kind of attention that could be both a blessing and a curse. The public outcry would be loud, but it would also bring the department under a microscope. Jada wasn't sure they were ready for. "They're already calling it a bad apple situation," Malik continued. "But this isn't just about Harris. This goes deeper. People are starting to ask questions about other officers, about what's really happening behind closed doors. The higher-ups are getting nervous." Jada's fingers drummed on the desk, a deep frown creasing her forehead. She knew exactly what this meant. The department would do everything in its power to protect its own, and Harris might just be the scapegoat they needed to deflect the real issue. It wasn't just Harris's actions that needed to be scrutinized. It was the culture that allowed men like him to flourish unchecked. "What's the next move?" Jada asked, her voice steady. Despite the unease in her chest, Malik hesitated, clearly grappling with the weight of the situation. "I've been talking to some people," he said quietly. "Off the record, there's a push to bury this. I want to make Harris the lone wolf and sweep everything else under the rug. But some of the higher-ups, they're worried about how this is going to look, starting to question how much they can hide. They might try to shut this down before it goes too far." Jada leaned forward, her jaw clenched. She had seen this kind of thing before: the efforts to quash the truth, to suppress the voices that could bring about real change. She wasn't about to let that happen. Then we don't let them, she said, her tone cold and determined. We make sure it doesn't get swept under the rug. Malik nodded slowly, a look of agreement in his eyes. That's what I'm afraid of. They'll come after you, Jada. They won't just go after Harris. They'll target anyone who pushes back. And right now, that's you. Jada exhaled slowly, her mind racing through the implications of what Malik was saying. She had already put herself on the line when she refused to back down during the traffic stop. But now, this was different. Now it was personal. She was no longer just a witness to injustice, she was the one actively fighting against it. And she knew that the road ahead would be long. It's filled with battles she wasn't sure she could win. We can't back down, Jada said firmly, her voice unwavering. We need to make this public. We need to expose what's really going on. If we don't do it now, it will just keep happening. More officers like Harris will keep getting away with it. Malik looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching. Hers? You know what you're asking for, right? You'll be putting your career on the line. The department won't take kindly to this. It won't just be Harris, you'll be going up against Title B. The whole system? Jada stared back at him, unblinking. She had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. She was no longer fighting for justice in the abstract. This fight had become personal. It was about the people who had been harmed by Harris's actions and others like him. It was about ensuring that the truth wasn't buried beneath lies and corruption. I know, Jada said quietly, but I'm willing to fight. If I don't, then who will? Malik exhaled, the weight of the situation settling heavily on him. I'll stand by you, he said finally, his voice resolute. We'll do this together, but you're right, this won't be easy. Jada's heart swelled with gratitude, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. There was too much at stake, too much that needed to be done, and now it was time to make her move. You're right, she said, standing up from her desk and walking over to the window. This isn't going to be easy, but it's the only choice we have. Jada turned back to face Malik, her expression hardening with determination. Tomorrow, we go public. We expose everything. No more hiding. Malik nodded, his gaze unwavering. Let's do it. The stakes were high, and the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. But Jada knew that she had made the right decision. It was time for the reckoning to begin. The trap is set. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting soft stripes of sunlight across Jada's desk. She sat there, her eyes focused intently on the open files before her. The weight of the day's task pressing down on her shoulders. Today was the day. The day she was going to expose the truth. The day she was going to make sure Officer Harris wasn't. It's the only one who paid the price for the abuse of power that had run unchecked for far too long. Jada had already sent out the initial press release, carefully crafted, meticulously planned. The media would be there soon, eager to latch on to the story. But what they didn't know was that Jada had a deeper plan. A plan that would ensure the exposure wasn't just about Harris, it was about everything he represented. The system that allowed officers like him to thrive, to manipulate and harm the very people they were supposed to protect, would be brought into the light. She had gathered her evidence carefully over the last few days. Officer Harris's past complaints, the multiple witnesses who had come forward but been silenced, the internal memos that showed how the department had covered for him. Everything was in place. She had the truth on her side, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. It's the department, the powers that be, wouldn't let it go down easily. They'd try to bury the story, shut her down. Jada had made sure to leave nothing to chance. She'd set the trap carefully, with precision. She knew the risks, and she was prepared to take them. The battle was no longer just about taking down one officer, it was about sending a message. The truth had to come out, and she would make sure it did. The knock on the door broke her concentration. It was Malik. Jada, you ready? He asked, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. His face was hard, his eyes filled with the kind of seriousness that only came when they were about to enter the eye of a storm. Jada looked up, nodding, ready as I'll ever be. Malik moved to stand beside her, glancing at the files spread out across her desk. You're sure about this? You know they won't make it easy. Once the media picks up on this, there's no turning back. I know, Jada said, her voice steady but carrying a note of finality. But it's time. Can't let them sweep this under the rug anymore. Malik's gaze softened for a moment, but then he straightened his shoulders. All right, let's do this then. We'll make sure they can't ignore it. Jada stood up, gathering the files and her notes. She took a moment to glance out the window, taking a deep breath. Her mind raced through the plan she had meticulously crafted over the last few days. It wasn't just about taking Harris down, it was about dismantling the culture that had allowed his behavior to go unchecked. You know how this is going to play out, right? Malik said, as if reading her thoughts. They'll try to spin it. They'll paint Harris as a rogue officer, maybe throw him under the bus. But it won't stop the deeper problem. They'll cover it up if they can. No, Jada said, her jaw tightening. But I've got something they can't cover up. We've got the evidence. It's airtight. We're going to make sure the public sees it. Malik didn't argue. He knew what was at stake. He'd been there through the years of frustration, of seeing the system fail, the people it was supposed to protect. He, too, knew how much work had to be done. But today, they were going to start. They would expose the truth, and no one would be able to silence them. The press conference was set for noon. As Jada walked into the briefing room, the weight of what she was about to do settled on her like a heavy coat. The room was filled with reporters, their cameras flashing as they whispered to each other, waiting for the official statement to begin. Jada's hands were steady as she placed the files. On the podium, her eyes scanning the crowd. Malik stood behind her, his posture rigid but supportive. She cleared her throat, and the room fell silent. The attention was all on her now. She had done her best to prepare for this moment, but no matter how much preparation she had done, she couldn't deny the truth. This was the beginning of something much bigger. The spotlight would be on her, and she had to make it count. Good afternoon, everyone, Jada began, her voice firm and confident. Thank you for being here today. I've called this press conference to address the arrest of Officer Clayton. Harris and too shed light on the actions that led up to his arrest, as well as the broader implications of his conduct. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. She could see the cameras clicking away, the reporters hanging on to every word. Officer Harris is not an isolated case, she continued, her voice growing stronger. His actions are part of a much larger pattern, one that has been ignored by the very system that is supposed to hold him accountable. Over the course of his career, Harris has been the subject of multiple complaints from both civilians and fellow officers. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and abuse of power. A murmur rippled through the room. Jada could feel the tension building as she revealed the evidence she had so carefully gathered. She could see the reporters scribbling, notes, their attention now fully on her. But Harris is not the only one, she said, her voice unwavering. His behavior is a symptom of a larger issue within the department, a system that has allowed officers like him to act with impunity. This is not just about one officer, it's about a culture of corruption and abuse that must be addressed. The room was dead silent now. Jada could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had made her statement. There would be questions. Hard questions. The department would undoubtedly try to discredit her, to undermine her. But she had the evidence. She had the truth. As she scanned the room, a reporter stood up, microphone in hand. Agent Sinclair. The reporter began, his voice filled with skepticism. You're accusing an entire department of covering up this behavior. Can you provide any concrete proof that these claims go beyond Officer Harris? Jada met his gaze, her eyes steely. Yes, she said, her voice clear and resolute. I've got the evidence. Internal memos, witness testimonies, and official complaints, all of it. We've gathered everything, and we've made it public. This is just the beginning. The truth is coming out, whether the department wants it or not. Another reporter raised their hand. What's next, Agent Sinclair? What do you hope to achieve with this exposure? Jada took a breath, her resolve solidifying. What I hope to achieve is accountability. I want the department to answer for its failures. I want the people who have been harmed by officers like Harris to know that their voices are being heard. And I want to make sure that the system that allowed this to continue is reformed. There were more questions, but Jada was ready. She had rehearsed her responses. She had anticipated their doubt, their attempts to downplay what she was doing, but she had something they couldn't deny. The truth was on her side. As the press conference drew to a close, Jada felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The trap had been set. The truth was out in the open. Now, all they could do was wait and see if the department would respond with the justice that was long overdue. The legacy rewritten. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind. Jada could hardly remember what it felt like to have a moment of peace. The media had picked up the story, and the coverage was relentless. Headlines screamed about corruption in the police department, and there were interviews with victims who had suffered at the hands of officers like Harris. The public outcry was deafening. Yet, even in the midst of all the noise, Jada remained resolute. She had done her part. The truth was out. Now it was up to the people in power to decide what to do with it. But as the weeks went on, Jada knew that the fight wasn't over. It had just begun. Her phone buzzed with a message from Malik, and she picked it up quickly, scanning the text. "We got the call? Harris is being moved to another facility for questioning. They're preparing to take it public this time. It's about to get real." Jada's fingers tightened around the phone. This was it. Harris was being held accountable. But the real work would come from holding the entire department accountable. She had done what she could, but the truth had only begun to reach its final destination. She had to keep pushing, no matter the cost. The last few days had felt like an unrelenting battle. Despite her public revelations, the department tried. To downplay the scope of the corruption, they offered Harris as a scapegoat, a lone bad apple who had somehow slipped through the cracks. But Jada wasn't buying it. She had already seen the cracks that ran far deeper than just one officer. As she arrived at the courthouse for the hearing, the weight of the moment hit her fully. This was where it would all come to a head. This was where the truth would either be validated or buried. She stepped out of her car, her mind racing. This wasn't just about Harris anymore. It was about every officer who had turned a blind eye to the abuse. Every person who had been harmed but couldn't speak out for fear of retaliation. This was their moment too. She walked into the building, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The air inside was cool, sterile, and filled with anticipation. The crowd was already gathering, reporters bustling about, setting up their cameras, preparing for what would surely be an explosive day. Jada made her way to the front, where she saw Malik already standing, his eyes scanning the room. His presence was a steadying force, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. "We're almost there," Malik said, his voice low but filled with a quiet determination. "Everything you said, it's happening. The people who've been covering this up, they're sweating now." Jada nodded, her gaze fixed on the courtroom doors. "We're just getting started. You can't silence the truth anymore." Didn't have long to wait. Soon the judge walked into the courtroom, his robes trailing behind him as the room fell silent. The trial began, and Harris was brought to the stand, shackled and looking far smaller than he had during that fateful traffic stop. The arrogance that had once radiated from him had been replaced with a mixture of fear and defiance. Jada couldn't help but notice the change. He had thought he was untouchable. Now he was nothing more than a figurehead, a pawn in a much larger game. As the proceedings unfolded, Jada's mind raced back to the evidence she had gathered. The victims who had bravely come forward to speak their truths. Harris was being painted as a lone officer who had made a series of mistakes. Knew the truth was far more complicated than that. It was systemic. It was ingrained in the department, the culture that allowed abuse to go unchallenged for years. The prosecutor stood up, speaking with a calm confidence as they laid out the case against Harris. Jada could feel her stomach twist as the charges were read aloud. Excessive force, racial profiling, abuse of power, the very things that had brought her to this point, that had fueled her relentless pursuit of justice, were being brought to light. But then came the moment Jada had been waiting for, the moment when she would take the stand. She stood, her heart beating faster now, a mix of anxiety and purpose filling her chest. This wasn't just about her story. It was about all the stories that had been ignored for so long. She walked to the witness stand, her back straight, her expression calm but resolute. She looked at the judge and the jury. And then, with steady hands, she placed the documents before them, the evidence that had taken months to gather, the undeniable proof that would show Harris wasn't an isolated case. The room was silent as she spoke, her voice carrying with strength. "The case against Officer Harris is only the beginning," Jada said, her words cutting through the tension in the room. "What you are hearing today is not an isolated incident. What you are hearing is a reflection of a culture that has allowed this kind of abuse to fester unchecked. Harris's actions were not a mistake. They were the result of a system that values power over accountability, protection over justice." The room was still. No one spoke. No one moved. Jada could feel the weight of her words sinking into the atmosphere. "I'm not here just to take down one officer," she continued. "I'm here to make sure that people like him don't get to hide behind their badges anymore. I'm here to make sure that no one else will have to go through what the victims in this case have gone through." Jada's eyes didn't waver from the jury as she finished. She knew what was at stake, and she knew what it would take to make the change that was so desperately needed. There would be no more sweeping things under the rug. No more pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. She would make sure that the truth got the attention it deserved. No matter who tried to stop it, the room remained quiet for a moment before the prosecutor spoke again, their voice filled with conviction. "Agent Sinclair has brought to light what many have tried to hide for years. Officer Harris's actions are not isolated. They are part of a larger system that has been allowed to continue unchecked, and that system must be held accountable." Jada took a deep breath, the tension in the room now palpable. She had done her part. Now it was up to the jury and the world to decide what would happen next. The final moments of the trial passed in a blur. The jury deliberated for what seemed like hours, and when they returned, the verdict was clear. Harris was guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and shock, but Jada stood still, her gaze fixed forward. It wasn't over. The victory was significant, but it was only the first step in a long journey. This was just one battle in a war that had been raging for far too long. As the courtroom cleared out, Jada felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. The fight wasn't over. But today they had made history. "Are you ready to keep fighting?" Malik asked, his voice soft as he approached. Her Dada Day nodded. "Always."